Hello again. I'm Laura Glazer, the host for today's assembly, and I just want to welcome everybody here. Joining us are Rebecca Copper and Minus Plato. Rebecca is an artist who is a second year in the Art and Social Practice MFA program. Their collaborator, Minus Plato, the persona and platform of ex-classicist Richard Fletcher, who teaches decolonial arts education at Ohio State University. Today, the two will discuss their recent collaborative work, World of Colonial Hills, Past, Present, Future, hosted through Minus Plato's radio platform, Dear Fellow Settler Colonizer, a program that you can tune into through verge.fm, a local internet radio station of Columbus, Ohio. Welcome, Rebecca and Minus Plato.
Thanks, Laura. I appreciate that. These things typically make me super nervous, so I'm gonna invite everybody to take a deep breath with me so that I can let my body calm down and know that it's gonna be okay. All right. So if everybody can take a deep breath in, inhale, and exhale. Thank you. I feel better. And it's actually the first time I've ever led a group breathing kind of thing. So thank you for those who participated. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And if you guys can let me know verbally whether you can, hold on. Are you guys seeing the right thing? Hold on one second. Okay, do you guys see World of Colonial Hills, Past, Present, and Future?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, let me get my notes. Okay, so before I jump into this project, I do want to kind of continue this conversation that happened before about social practice in and of itself, especially as how I relate to it as an artist and a student. And also how social practice and that mode of working connects to this current project that I'm about to talk about. And I'd like to note that social practice provides us the space, and as Lisa was already talking about, it allows us to be responsive in a way that maybe working in different ways of making art maybe doesn't allow you to be. Especially when things don't go as planned. In this project, World of Colonial Hills, Past, Present, and Future, I feel like is a great example of when you plan something to go in a particular way and it doesn't. But approaching this project from this angle of continual learning and leaning into these spaces of unknowing, and not claiming a position of expertise per se, I think this project can still provide insight, grounding, understanding, and maybe after I give you guys a little bit more information about what this project was, maybe even a space for reimagining. Oh, and I also want to point out that Richard and I are tuning in from the ancestral lands of Kaskaskia, the Shawandasi Tula, the Miamia, and the Hopewell peoples, aka Ohio. I also want to acknowledge that land acknowledgements aren't enough. And while they are a great start on a particular trajectory towards reparations, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Okay. And moving further into this project, though, World of Colonial Hills, Past, Present, and Future, this project extends from work that I did last year, a project auditing in Ohio, where I worked with fourth grade students and their teacher, Kevin Acton, at Colonial Hills Elementary, where my son went to school. It was actually within his class, his fourth grade class. Kevin and I held workshops where we worked with the students to audit their social studies textbooks. And often when I would talk about this project, Auditing Ohio, the name of the school, Colonial Hills Elementary, would come up in discussions, and people would question that, oh, that's an interesting name, Colonial Hills Elementary. So moving from the name of the school to the actual place, the neighborhood, Colonial Hills, I wanted to further investigate the identity of place. How did residents relate to the name of the place? And what would happen if the name of this neighborhood were to be questioned in relation to what I consider, and I think a lot of people consider, a pretty problematic history of imperialism? And these photos I am showing you are photographs that I took after my mother and I rented a house in Colonial Hills. We lived there for about a year, so we were temporary residents. I would go around the neighborhood and I would walk with this disposable camera and I would take these photographs. So I'm showing you these photos though to kind of give you a visual reference of what Colonial Hills is like. And to me, it's very emblematic of what US suburbs typically look like, which reinforces this kind of delusion of an iconic American dream. And so I reached out to Richard Fletcher, aka Minus Plato, and I asked if he would be willing to collaborate with me under the guise of his radio show, Dear Fellow Settler Colonizer, to organize a conversation with the Colonial Hills community. Richard not only brought his platform, his radio platform, but he brought his classist knowledge of the Latin language to help us define what colonial even really means. He also brought his own personal identity as he immigrated to the US from the UK. And so we posted up flyers requesting community members to meet us at Park Boulevard Park, which sits right in front of the Colonial Hills neighborhood signage. And I do want to give a shout out to both Richard and Laura for helping me kind of conceptualize this. Maybe passing, I got a lot of visual inspiration from a project that Laura actually did through the $100 commission, which you'll see on Friday. So I highly recommend checking that out. But after I posted these signs, I kind of patrolled the neighborhood to see how many tabs were taken, to estimate if people would show, if there was any interest. And I started getting really excited when I saw that there was a large number of tabs taken from these posters. I was thinking, oh my goodness, people actually care. This might be a really cool and engaging conversation. So I had a particular expectation in mind. But then on the day of, it rained all day. It downpoured. But Richard and I still posted up. We sat under a small canvas tent and we waited for people to show up. But no one came. Absolutely no one. I mean, I was there, Richard was there, my son Adrian, as you see pictured here, was there, and my partner. And so we recorded a conversation just between the four of us. And I'm going to share some of that audio with you. I will say it's about 10 minutes, and I know that can seem like a long time and may be unbearable, especially through Zoom, but I really hope that you can engage in the audio. We did a total of 80 minutes of recording, but this is only 10 minutes of it.
Okay, so here we are on Dear Fellow Settler Colonizer. It's a radio show for Verge FM. So I'm Richard Fletcher, and I work under the pseudonym of Minus Plato. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why I have that strange name. And as I said, I am the host for this radio show, which is called Dear Fellow Settler Colonizer. And again, I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But yeah, so I will just pass it on to my collaborator in this, Rebecca Copper.
Hi, I am Rebecca Copper. I am an artist and a graduate student at Portland State University, a part of the Art and Social Practice MFA program. And I relate to Colonial Hills as a previous resident. I moved here in 2017. My son has been going to Colonial Hills Elementary. I guess technically he's now going to Worthing Way, but I'm interested in having a conversation about the naming of this place and our relation to it as community members. So I have asked Richard Fletcher to collaborate with me and extend the conversation to other community members and residents of this place. So
when Rebecca asked me about this project and we started talking about it, I wanted to reflect a little bit on this word colonial. So how I connect to this word colonial. And as I mentioned, this is the radio show Dear Fellow Settler Colonizer. So there's this idea of the word colonizer, and that kind of brings with it certain connotations of someone that comes into some place where they want to impose themselves and take it over. Like colonizing something means to somehow take it over for themselves. So colonial and colonizer are obviously related, but there's just a different kind of valence to that colonizer. And we'll come back to that a little bit later as well. But as you can tell from the way I'm speaking, I'm not originally from these shores and this country or the state of Ohio. I grew up and was born in the UK, in England, born in Nottingham, and then lived in Leicester in the Midlands, and then in London, and then moved to Ohio in 2006. And so when I think about colonial things, I have a frame of reference that comes from the British Empire. And I'm thinking about colonial projects, not only the United States before it became its own country, but actually when it was under colonial rule by the United Kingdom. But also beyond that, the colonial, the British Empire in places like India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, all over in Hong Kong, all over these areas of the world, Palestine, Egypt, all of these places that are former colonies of the United Kingdom. And when Rebecca told me about colonial hills, I was thinking, where have I heard this idea of the colonial hill before? Like the idea of colonialism, all these kind of things. Yes, I've got this association with the British Empire, but what about colonial hills? And when I started to dig a bit deeper into colonial hills, I came across a series of areas in British Imperial India. And there's a hill areas, one is the Darjeeling, where we know the tea, the Darjeeling tea. And these were kind of colonial hill forts where members of the British elites could go and have this experience in this faraway land that was a bit like their experience back home. It was very kind of luxurious. It was a place where they could have certain experiences that were reminding them of what it was like to be back in England. And so these were kind of outposts in Imperial India that kind of exuded that. The other frame of reference that I bring to this situation and this project is the very word colonial. So I said I'd explain what minus Plato means. And minus Plato is a blog, a web platform, a persona that I've been developing for nearly 10 years, because I used to be a classicist, and that meant that I used to teach ancient Greek and Latin and study the ancient Mediterranean cultures of Greece and Rome. And I was really interested in how contemporary artists engaged with these ancient cultures. But also I ended up leaving that field of study and to get more into art education. And that's what has got me here, and also engaging in this radio show with global indigenous art making as part of the Dear Fellow Settler Colonizer project. But my Latin training brings me back to the very word colonial, which comes from the Latin noun colonia, which means a colony, but also the verb colere, which means to cultivate or to care for. And it's really used to think about the land itself. So a colonist was a farmer and someone that lived on the land and settled the land and looked after the land. So this idea of colonial as actually being bound up with a care for the land is something that I kind of am reminded of by the etymology, the origins of the word colonial. At the same time, when we think about the word culture, it comes from the same root. And so you think about a division between cultured people and non-cultured people. And the ancient Greeks would describe the barbarians versus the Hellenes. that would also imply that within colonial, there'd be the place that has been cultivated and made cultured. And so there's this kind of sense that Colonial Hills has this element to it that is, before it was all barbaric and uncultured, but thanks to the colonizer, it becomes cultured and refined and these kinds of elements. So what does it mean to think of this name? What does it mean to think back across different empires, different historical contexts, as well as today? What does it mean to engage with the colonial in the widest possible terms?
Thinking about this, and even the way in which many places things are named after colonialism, like Colonial Hills, and what does that mean? What happens when people think of colonial or colonial spaces, colonialism? It almost seems like sometimes they don't quite understand the connection to history or what the actual actions were behind colonialism and what happened, you know, not only in the United States, but in a global context. So there's almost a romanticizing of colonial history that I think needs to be reconsidered, right? So what happens when we open up a space for a dialogue that reconsiders what it means to be a colonizer or to live in a space that is named Colonial Hills, for example? So I have a question for Adrian. So what does colonial or colonialism, what does that mean to you?
You could try putting it in a sentence. My mother talks a lot about colonialism.
From what I have gathered from my mom talking a lot about colonialism, is that basically it's where a bunch of white dudes come in, raid the place, imprison people, take over in any way they can, and try and rule. That's all I know.
What happens to the people that were there before the white dudes came?
Either killed,
Mm-hmm.
pushed out,
Mm-hmm.
or enslaved.
You know, where do we go from that answer to the name Colonial Hills?
So I want to thank everybody. I know that was a long listening period, so I really appreciate your time and listening to the entirety of that. And if you are interested in hearing more of it, it will be a part of an episode that will be released in July or August. Richard and I think are still working through that, a part of the Dear Fellow Settler Colonizer radio show. Yeah. So while I find this conversation that happened just between the four of us still valuable, it didn't have a kind of feedback. It didn't have the back and forth that I hoped for. And I'm not sure this kind of space that I wanted to cultivate in confronting history or questioning what Ariella Aisha Azule calls the imperial markers, or imagining a potential future actually happened. So what I hope to do today with the time that's left, I hope to extend this conversation with everybody here and to ask you to help us create this space of questioning and maybe even reimagining. And then to bring some thoughts of what was being discussed in some of my classes over this past term. Things came up such as, like, if we change the name, would that erase the truth of the history, as in maybe it's better to be named what it is? But on the flip of that, does renaming or questioning the name create a kind of gap of reconciliation or changing a particular kind of trajectory and not accepting what just is because it is? So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And hold on one second, my screens are, there we go. And invite everybody to further this, this conversation.
Rebecca, can I just add one element which I think is important for everyone to kind of understand why the absence of the community beyond your immediate family in the project meant that, and this wasn't part of the clip, although it's kind of where a direction I went in one of the other areas of the future show that we'll release, is I tried to kind of ventriloquize I guess a kind of defensive position as to this idea of the colonial. So to try and think of contexts in which even the kind of name would actually have a positive valence to it, that actually would think about possibly even the interrelation between indigenous and settler communities as one of shared space. And so I think it was, so I just wanted to bring this to kind of the fore in this context, whether, to even start from a kind of positive conception of colonial hills to then kind of work back from that point. Because again, I also explained that it's kind of perverse me coming into this space and asking about a kind of positive reinforcement of the colonial. But just to kind of think about that as a starting point for our conversation, what was in the minds of the people that named this place as at the beginning, and what was it that gave this positive element to the colonial that Rebecca and I are trying to question or unlearn, as it were, in this project.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that information. And sharing some more elements of the conversation to better frame. Yeah.
I have a question. So in terms of talking about this within a historical context, could you also maybe loop in and talk about the demographic of the community in which this name is kind of part of? And is there, what is the demographic, like what histories are they clinging to? I'm thinking about like maybe post World War II or whatever, parts that really cling to patriotism. Can you talk a little bit towards that?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Shelby. So to give some background on the exact plotment of Colonial Hills, it was plotted in 1920. But it wasn't actually developed until World War II, when there was the war, like the rise of the war industries. And so it was created to house a lot of people who were working in factories and creating warplanes. So it was specific to like aviation, war aviation. And I think, there are definitely, I think, some generations within the community that extend from that. But that was in, the 1940s and on. So I guess I'm not 100% sure of how everybody identifies within that space or within that community. But from my experience of living there and from what I could visually see, and again, there's always assumptions through just like what you see visually even, it appeared that a lot of the demographic were like middle class, European American centric.
I'll just add to that, it's not so much about the demographic, but in the 1950s, I think in like 54, 55, there was a debate about whether Colonial Hills would be part of Columbus, the city, or of this region north of the city, the village, I guess, of Worthington, Ohio. And actually in the radio show, we talk about the naming of this place, Worthington, which comes from Thomas Worthington, an early governor of Ohio. And that story of choosing Worthington over Columbus might inform us a little bit towards the demographic too. There are areas north, or actually that surround the city of Columbus. The most kind of infamous is Upper Arlington, with a 99.7% white population. where many university professors live, where it's a very suburban and to some extent affluent area. Worthington is kind of parallel to Upper Arlington a little bit. So the removal from Columbus, even like Columbus City Schools as well, where the demographic is, I believe in Columbus City Schools, 30+% African American population as well. So I think that decision to be part of Worthington might inform some of our discussions of the demographics. But I'm just a visitor here, so I don't, Rebecca has lived in this place, so I can't speak to it.
I have a follow-up question. Don't take too much time with me, but it seems like there is a really interesting juxtaposition between positioning a question to a community, but also through the schools and through auditing Ohio, like you had mentioned, kind of bringing this question or this like critical thinking to a new generation of community members that will be growing up. How do you envision, is there a difference in how this question could be answered or could be kind of critically looked at between the community members versus the kids? And how do you see the difference maybe between those two?
I think when I think about the how maybe a generation like the students versus their parents, right, or the kids might respond to this question, I guess I'm thinking of how children are deeply influenced by the things that their parents believe. But how does that change or transition within schools? And this is why I think it's really important to consider education and what we teach. And especially now as there's like this push for critical race theory bans within schools, which I think is personally, I think this is extremely problematic because that space within education or within schools, and specifically K-12 schools, I think can be a space where students can formulate their own opinions based on what, facts, rather than the opinions that might be maybe misled by their parents. Again, I don't, this is all, assumptions, and I don't know anything about their lives. I'm just, speculating. But yeah, I guess my answer is that it's really dependent on the school system.
Hey, Rebecca, this is Lisa. I have a question too. Is this a good time? Okay.
Yeah, no, please.
Okay. I was actually really curious, this question about demographics that Shelby kind of brought into the conversation, and then adding to, okay.
Oh, your sound went out. I don't know.
Is it mine?
Oh.
What your collaborator can y'all hear me all right? I've got like,
it kind of broke up a little bit. I got a little bit of the robot voice. Excuse me.
How's that?
Better, much better.
Okay. This idea of naming happening in the mid 50s, right? Mid 1950s. And if I stand back a little bit or sort of pan out a little bit and think about what's happening in terms of urban planning across the country, this is also when we see the development of, wartime living establishments, but then we also have the beginning of the establishments of so-called suburbia, right? And white flight and the establishment of communities. Even it's not just the colonial part to me, it's the hills, right? So it's like, it's colonial elevation.
Yeah.
So there's two words to that name. And when I think about demographics, Rebecca, you described it as primarily folks of Western European descent. I would just call that, okay, so it's white people. And a decision to not be included within Columbus, the urban center where the proportions or percentages of Black folks is much higher based on the information that you shared. I don't have, I'm not an expert on Columbus, as you know, but I've been there. I've seen Rebecca there even. And so I am curious about this idea. So, you know, you're bringing in etymology, the history of the word, this idea of caring for a place. Makes me think a lot about feminist theory and, you know, this notion that like something wild is untamed and something tamed is therefore good, and care being really disassociated from relationships to care of land that doesn't look like one particular specific care of land, which is the way Indigenous communities might offer a different sort of paradigm here. And so in the context of a project where you see some interest based on people removing a contact slip, but then nobody showing up, Rebecca, you're sort of connecting that to the weather. I'm immediately connecting that to something else, right? Like whether there is care or an interest in the conversation, what does it mean to care for a place in the present tense that honors its history and sort of the waves of history that have clearly washed over a place. And so I'm curious within a project like then, oh God, and then Shelby brought it back to schools, right? And then Rebecca's like, okay, but it's about education and kids. And then I'm thinking, right, but we all know that public education has its blinders on within the US, certainly, I can speak to that. And we also know that so much learning about how we understand place comes not from school, but from home. And so when I think about a conversation like this, where the public that is required to have it are absent, I'm curious to know what you are both thinking about how we move a conversation like this forward. I love the title of your radio show, by the way. I think that's really, really intriguing. But how does this conversation sort of level up to begin to include all of the complexity and the nuance that is just at a very baseline level on the table right now? Honest question, like where do you see this? Where do you see next steps?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the insights that you brought too, especially how there's a lot of informal learning that is important. And you brought that up earlier in the introduction. And you're totally right. Like there's only so much you can get from a school system, like from a classroom. Although I think it is an important piece, especially it gives space, I think, for students to maybe own their own opinions too, maybe if they can't at home. But yeah, and where does this conversation go? I think that's a good question. I've thought about doing it again, like taking the flyers around and posting them back up and asking them to come and making sure that it's not going to be a rainy day and still just sitting there. I don't know if that will happen or if that's the best motive or like move, next move. And there was even the question of like maybe directly, like before I put up the posters, I was toying with the idea of creating pamphlets and literally going door to door and handing them to people. But then like the idea of actually delivering to 800 houses plus seemed really overwhelming and hard to do. And this seemed like a good way to actually get like feedback, right? To see if like, you know, by ripping off a tag, I can visually see there's an interest. Yeah, so I don't have an answer completely. I don't know, Richard or Minus, Plato, do you have thoughts?
So thank you, Lisa. So one thing that I think is important is when Rebecca and I were designing the flyer, we originally had the title of the radio show kind of at the top, and I suggested that we remove it because there is something targeting about the title of the radio show. As I mentioned actually in our conversation in the rain, that I named it after the TV show, since we're on TV right now, Dear White People. But I also wanted it to be Dear Fellow, and kind of think about what that fellow kind of meant, like trying to put myself in actually literally putting myself in the self-critical position. I am a settler, I am a colonizer in these ways. And how can I even have these conversations with Indigenous artists in a way that actually constantly addresses my settler identity, and bound up with that is of course whiteness. And So that was important that we kind of pulled back from that. And there might be one way forward could be to pull back even more with that, my role in the collaboration, and then reintroduce it at some point. The other thing that I think is important is Rebecca had talked about maybe one of the school teachers at the school who teaches social studies, I believe, had said they were going to turn up. And so one option I think might be to re-engage with that teacher and maybe share some of the things that we discussed as well. And also, I don't want to underestimate the role that Rebecca's son played in this project. Adrian, who you hear speaking in that clip at the end, it was incredible, like his response to this question. And what followed after that was a discussion of, is it, what would it mean to rename the school? And we talked about Greek mythology. I didn't bring it up, but he brought it up as like the school of Athena, and we were talking about this. And then he was thinking, oh, it might be problematic because everyone would start calling their friends' ideas stupid, and they wouldn't actually get to a name. But one thing that Adrian did agree was that they'd want to change the name because either there wasn't a connection to this term colonial hills, or some of these negative elements to the name were actually apparent to him. So I think Adrian did represent, I know that he lives with Rebecca, and so hears about colonialism a lot of the time, but I think that was important. I also want to say, Lisa, that what you said about hills is really, really important too. I do think that that uplift question and the racialized element of that uplift, I think, is really, really central to this.
Thank you both. Appreciate that.
I have a question, and might be, yeah. I'm just wondering how you guys would talk about this. I'm wondering about. I mean, Rebecca and I we briefly talked about this in the past, but I'm just wondering if you guys can talk about the difference between the word unlearning and relearning, because it's like once you learn how to walk, you never can unlearn it, and relearning something would be different ways of walking. I'm just wondering how you guys think about these two words.
I remember that conversation, Sohaila. I'm glad you brought it up. Oh, sorry, Adrian's walking and asking for seltzer water. They're up on the top shelf. Thank you. Can you close the door, please? Thank you. Anyways, moms, what it means to be a mom. I'm sorry, question, unlearning, relearning. Okay, yeah. I think that's a good point, right? Like once you learn something, you can't really just erase it like it never happened. It's there. And I think, yeah, maybe relearning is a good term, as like, okay, so this thing existed, and maybe relearning or reestablishing your relationship to this thing and what it means for you, and how do you engage with it, and what is the next step, right? And this idea of like just moving in a way because that's always what has happened, or that is just what is. I think, when you relearn something, you can't do that. When more information comes in, then you can maybe pivot or transition from moving in a particular direction or in a way, or engaging with something differently.
I would add another term as well that in the kind of decolonial theoretical text that I've engaged with, someone like Walter Mignolo or Catherine Walsh, who describe this concept of delinking. And I think delinking has this valence to it, which is to disconnect from established criteria for learning and structures of learning. And so, unlearning is a process that would allow for a relearning later. And actually, there's a really important kind of problem with unlearning as well, which is actually quite a slightly boring ancient philosophical problem, which is like how can you actually know anything if you don't already kind of know it in some way already, right? And this goes back to Plato's Meno. Sorry, just performing my minus Platoism of it all. But there has to be a kind of sense of, can you unlearn something if you're coming to it, for the first time, or that you kind of have there's a hidden curriculum that you haven't even been given access to that knowledge before you even process it, and that's a really challenging question. Just to give one example, and this is really articulating my ignorance. I just had a conversation with an American Palestinian artist, and I've only just, and this is quite shameful, I only just heard of the Balfour Declaration from 1917, where this basically a memo from two British government officials basically gifting the land of Palestine to the Zionists in 1917. And, I think that it's so important that my ongoing education and my role as an educator brings us to that moment in order thinking about unlearning ongoing colonial violence. But what happens when even something so important as that fact is not known at the outset? And I think that that's one of the biggest problems that I find with at least blanket claims of unlearning, is like, well, look, we need to start from a position of recognizing what is the kind of basis for learning already. So that's my immediate response. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
So I want to ask a question about the process of potentially renaming a place. And I want to ask everybody if they could have some input. But what do you think? I mean, should a place like Colonial Hills be renamed, or should it not be? And what difference does it make whether it's renamed or not? Like, what do you guys think?
I actually have, I had a question prior to you asking this question in relation to this question, if that makes sense. When I was living in Chicago, I remember walking down the streets, and there are many streets that have two names. And it was very interesting because one of them was in a very fine sort of print and very, very vintage looking, and the other ones are very contemporary, and so you could tell which names were the old names and which names were the new names. And I always felt a little bit conflicted about the whole setup. But when you ask this question, I'm just wondering, would as you mentioned, would renaming or renaming solve the issue, or if there are other ways to still think about the issue, bring it out to the public without erasing the past. I didn't answer your question, I know. Sorry.
No, but I think it's it's good to think about. And I guess part of wanting to have this community conversation was to spark this idea of considering the name, what it means, and everything that it implicates. And maybe even have a space of what Richard was talking about. You can't unlearn something or learn something different outside of, if you don't know something already, right? And I guess, I don't know, I'm assuming that people who live in Colonial Hills have their own connections and their own understanding of what colonial means.
Rebecca, can I add that, just briefly, the fact that Colonial Hills is in Worthington, Ohio, and we don't even need to go into Columbus. I mean, Columbus, we can start with this, but it's actually a really interesting process to think about. So naming, naming something after a person, I think there might be a more direct process. I mean, we're watching live the efforts to rename Ryerson University in Toronto right now, which are really essential as a architect of the residential school systems after the horrific news of the remains of over 100 Indigenous school children. But what would it mean if the topic of Colonial Hills was a way to understand who this guy Thomas Worthington was? And for example, and this is another naming issue, Thomas Worthington's estate just outside Chillicothe, Ohio, is the Adana estate, the Adana mansion. And Rebecca mentioned the Hopewell people, the ancient people of the Mississippi Basin. And the Adana are another group of ancient indigenous peoples of this land, but they're named after an estate by an early governor of the state. And so, there's a kind of knock-on effect of this naming issue. And I think, interestingly, by focusing on colonial and the kind of, wait, what does it mean? We've been having these discussions about the colonial pipeline or, something else. Like, it just seems kind of innocuous. But once you start really looking at it, you get to these names of colonizers in the past, and then you get to, the kind of poster figure for colonization in this country, which is Christopher Columbus. And so you get to these issues just by being within a community here. And I think that's what the real kind of exciting thing about Rebecca's project, and why I'm so grateful to be part of it, is that she's located a kind of a crack. And this goes back to decolonial thinking, the kind of finding the cracks in the system. And I think that she has found a crack in this kind of sleepy suburb where her son used to go to school. And I really hope that this is where it kind of expands from.
Thanks, Richard. And thinking too about naming in itself is like this kind of ownership too. So when we even talk about Thomas Worthington, right, and his mansion, or how even, where Colonial Hill sits is within Worthington, these places. So then there's like a kind of ownership that extends, right, from a type of person or a group of people. I don't know, I'm just kind of thinking about this. What does it mean to own something, right? Who really owns anything? I don't know if anybody has responses to that.
Hey, this is Lisa again. I mean, I think that there's an obvious inherent problem in the question, right? You can't own, how do you own something that's unceded? So it's been taken. So naming takes on a different tone. So to answer your original question, Rebecca, I guess to me, naming maybe begins a conversation, but certainly doesn't fix a problem. And I think that naming is a gesture toward, in this day and age, I'm thinking there are also a lot of conversations happening right now about monuments, right? Like how we think about monuments within contemporary popular culture. And naming can be a very valuable first step, but it can also be an incredibly empty gesture. So we change the name of things all the time. And naming is a way we call towards something so that we can collectively recognize it. And there's value in that, in my opinion, certainly. There's also an incredible danger in imagining that renaming is enough, or that renaming is truly a reparation, right? And so to unlearn, yes, we're suggesting that there is an existing structure of learning that's present, but unlearning is in fact possible. And if we were to think about like therapy research, for example, how do you break a bad habit? How do you survive a trauma? How do you, right, et cetera, et cetera. Learning is about repetition and habits. So you rewire by repeating something. So to me, it's really a question about what do we want to repeat? And what does that revisiting something in a new way, in a regular fashion, offer us? Is erasure necessary if we're renaming, right? Is it inherent in the process, potentially? I'm not giving any answers here, but I guess it's a question that to me is much more complex than just like, what happens if we rename it? When your son described what colonization was, to me, that came from home. That didn't come from school. And he knew. And when you ask the follow-up question about impact, like what happened to the people, he gave 3 very succinct answers, and he did not seem conflicted. Now, what happens when you get competing information and messages? That's where decision-making happens, right? So when you get to decide how you feel about something, means that you have to have enough information to make a decision, and that choices are potentially inherent. So I don't know. I think it's a really interesting conversation. And I do wonder how the community of, what is this called? Colonial Hills. Oh my God. Deal with this question. I don't know. And do they want to? Do they even see it as a problem? To me, that's where unlearning, the question of unlearning, begins within the context of this conversation. Thank you.
Can I add to what just Lisa mentioned? I wrote this down like 5 minutes ago, maybe, that education really starts from home. And, thinking about the way you guys, this project has been portrayed as of now, it feels like it's looking at the outside, but really what Lisa mentioned, the education that your son has comes from home, and how do we, you as a mother, the conversations you have with your son, how would you make it accessible to other homes and other kids, thinking about, they have a palette that is, not stained yet. and the whole idea of, relearning, then how do we teach them something that they don't have to relearn, later on? So that's why I think the project you did with your son and his school was absolutely valuable.
Thank you, Sohaila and Lisa. I appreciate that. I do want to check with Laura because I realize it's 4:53. So technically we're supposed to be in break, but I wasn't sure if there's time to respond or not to respond. I don't know.
Go for it.
Okay. I guess hearing Sohaila and Lisa, I'm thinking about actions too. Like, of course, even as I was trying to read through this, like land acknowledgement and recognizing like that can be a super empty gesture. Just as Lisa was saying, stating something verbally and naming it can be a good first step. But I think, there's a lot more that needs to happen. So I guess with this project, I was hoping to open that kind of crack maybe that Richard was talking about with the community. So I guess I'm still waiting for that feedback from them. I'm like, there's a lot of answers I don't have because they didn't engage with me fully. Yeah, so I am interested too myself, like what are those action steps that need to happen?
It was really interesting as an experience, though, because your son and your partner were there, that it became a family discussion as well. I mean, I was there, but it started out as a community discussion, and it became a discussion within the family about. I mean, you should mention that your partner had worked at that school. And did not, get any sense of any friction in relation to this naming when he worked there.
Yeah, definitely. He was a substitute teacher for a short period. Yeah, and in connecting even with what Sohaila was saying about, it's like these intimate spaces, like the home, where a lot of this learning happens. Yeah, and yeah, my son has a particular perspective because of the conversations that we have, like the one that happened with Richard. So I don't know what it would be like. How do I engage people in that intimate setting of their own home, especially if there's difference of opinion? You know, what does that look like? Yeah, so, but I'll wrap this up. Thank you, everybody, for listening and participating.